When creating a character for the first time, you have quite a lot to consider. What weapon path you're going, what attunement you'll be choosing, and a whole list of boons and flaws that you can choose from. Depending on what you choose, however, each boon or flaw can either make your life a lot easier, or it can lead to more annoyance than actual good. So without further ado, we're gonna rank all of them on a tier list from S all the way to F, starting with a flaw that is a complete trap. Starting off with the vegetarian flaw. This flaw doesn't sound that bad on paper since you can just go find ingredients and cook food or buy a bunch of it. However, that costs a lot of time that you could spend doing something else. Vegetarian has a few other niche issues that make it a really annoying flaw to pick as well. Since you have to stockpile on food to avoid going hungry every 3 seconds, if you ever end up dying, then you'll drop a lot of stuff in your inventory, including the food you're carrying. Not to mention, most foods will take 2 weight in your inventory to carry, which can take up quite a lot of space that you can be using to carry other stuff. Even if you stockpile on food, you'll still find yourself running out, especially if you spend some time in the depths. There's just much better options to pick, especially when carnivore exists. I'll put this one in D tier. Next up, squeamish. This flaw makes it so whenever you grip someone, you lose about 3% of your hunger. This isn't really that bad, but when you have to grip multiple enemies in a row, it can stack up quite a lot. You can completely counteract this effect with the carnivore talent, as killing mobs will give you hunger instead, which is quite good. One slight issue is that gripping enemies with a food buff actively takes away some of the food buff. But other than that, it's definitely not a bad choice. I'll put this in B tier, just don't use it with vegetarian. The autodidact boon. Remember when everyone thought this boon was the best? Sadly though, autodidact doesn't give you free investment points for powering up. Since you require event EXP in order to power up, what you get from killing mobs, you can't just save a bunch of points and spend them on a campfire to skip to the next power. The only use for autodidact is a trial of 1, since you don't require event EXP there to power up. Because of this, an Adread with autodidact can get an extra 3 power levels starting from the trial of 1. That's all autodidact really has going for it though, which is why this is going in the E tier. We're gonna start by speedrunning the next 2. Obvious. Considering the fact that most enemies see you from really far away either way, obvious is not a bad flaw to pick at all. As long as you're behind an enemy or not in their vision range, they won't be able to chase you anyways. Obvious is obviously never a problem, since Deepwoken isn't a stealth game. So let's go to the bottom of A tier. Gourmet. This is a boon I'll personally never use, but I can see why some people like it. You get 50% more hunger and thirst out of your food, which can be a pretty big difference. It's barely ever useful, but when it is, it can be worth it. C tier. Now, let's talk about something that many people have mixed opinions over. Hemophilia. Hemophilia is a flaw that causes your character to take extra blood damage when hit. Some people think this flaw is a free point, but others argue that hemophilia is really bad. So, who's right exactly? I wanted to find that out. So I decided to run some tests on a Power 8 Adread Freshie. One with hemophilia and one without. And after getting hit many times by the Ministry NPCs, the results showed that the Power 8 Adread without hemophilia took exactly 1.5 bars in blood damage, while the one with hemophilia took 1.75 bars of blood damage. If we run some quick math, that totals to around an extra 15% blood damage you'll be receiving with hemophilia. So does that extra 15% really matter? Well, not really anyway. It's quite an annoying flaw to have early game though, since that's when you notice it the most. It does run serious risk though if you're choosing to use the Curse of No Life King. So just because of that, I'll place it at the top of C tier. Maverick. This shit doesn't. Oh hey look, it's Survivalist. Survivalist is quite a unique boon. You are more resistant to every environmental effect, granting you complete immunity to acid rain and making parasites kill you 33% slower in Flaw 1. And that's pretty much where the benefits end. It's rarely useful, I just wish it was given more. C tier. Deficient. This flaw has been referred to as one of the worst in the game. So much so that if you get it from Shrine of Order, most people would just tell you to wipe and entirely remake your build. Deficient makes your ether regeneration slower, significantly interfering with your ability to cast mantras. Except it doesn't. Take a look at this. Both slots have the exact same amount of ether and tempo. Yet both slots are losing ether at the exact same rate despite one having deficient and one not. This flaw should make your ether regeneration even just a tiny bit slower, but when we slow the footage down, we find out that's not the case at all. It's honestly surprising sometimes how much stuff in this game can be misinformation and placebo. They might fix this flaw's downside at some point, but for now, I'm putting this in A tier. It's just a free point. Now we got Steadfast. This boon makes you retain about 33% more armor durability when you're attacked. Getting more use out of your armor is extremely useful in every combat scenario, since you can maintain both your physical and elemental resistance for longer. But that's not where the benefits end. If you also decide to choose the Armor Conserver talent, a talent that only requires reaching power 8, you could be losing up to 50% less armor when hit, which is extremely beneficial. It may not affect natural armor as well, but fellas, this is an S tier, without a doubt. And now, we go from the best boon in the game to Blind. I don't know anyone who would unironically choose this flaw besides to challenge your sense of direction or something. If you somehow don't believe me, here's what a normal person sees without the blind flaw, and here's how much you see if you choose this monstrosity. Yeah, it's bad! Since your visibility is also determined by the amount of light around you, this also means that this flaw gets worse in darker areas, including the depths! So, good luck not walking the Corrupt King Thresher or in the Void by accident. Anyways, yeah, this is F tier. Scrapper. Every time you get a Whisper Hand when leveling up, which are every 2 power levels with the exceptions of powers 9 and 19, you get 1 ace that you can spend to burn or freeze any card. If you have the Scrapper boon though, you'll still receive 1 ace. But every other Whisper Hand, you'll get 2 aces instead of 1, which are at powers 4, 8, 10, etc. Since you can only get 12 Whisper Hands per character normally, this bumps up your total ace count from 12 to 18. It makes it a really good boon for builds that need to burn a lot of bad cards, especially with the new dual attunement paths and mantras coming out. This is definitely a solid A tier. Now, Manic is up next, and I don't have much to say other than, what the hell? This is considered a flaw? Manic makes it so all insanity gained from attacks are heavily amplified, meaning that you don't actually go insane in the depths faster. Despite being called a flaw, this is the only flaw in the game that can be genuinely beneficial to the user. When you pair it with talents that capitalize on insanity like Lose Your Mind and Piercing Will, they can be really powerful. It's a strong A tier for sure. Glutton is another one of those flaws that you get from the Shrine of Order, completely forget you have, and then end up nearly starving to death at some point. Increasing your hunger and thirst drain by nearly double, the Glutton flaw makes it quite annoying to manage yourself from not starving to death. I remember having this flaw in one of my characters for a while, and man, fighting Kaido in the water makes your hunger and thirst vanish so fast, it's basically a worse version of Squeamish. I can't give this higher than E tier. Accumula is up next as one of the more niche boons on this list. This boon increases your carry load by 50 at default, which, don't get me wrong, is pretty handy to have. You can also stack up to 25 food in your inventory instead of the default 10, which would actually be fine if there wasn't a talent that already did that. This boon has some good use for farming notes and hoarding valuables, but now that banks are in the game now, I just feel like there's much better options to have, which is why I'm putting this in the D tier. Ah, Fugitive. Nothing beats walking out of spawn and immediately getting a warm greeting from the residents. Obviously, there's no reason you should pick this flaw outside of if you want to challenge yourself, since you aren't really safe anywhere. Every faction is constantly hunting you, but despite that, you can still sell, use, and buy things from towns. The second any guard sees you, though, Fugitive's downsides can be negated in the long term by gaining enough reputation with a faction to consider yourself neutral, but I mean, when you look at how many factions are in the game, oh my god, dude, this is F tier. The Sly Boon is honestly something I completely forgot about until I started making this video, and it's probably for good reason. This is one of the things where the devs ran out of ideas for extra content, looked at a random talent card, and said, fuck it. If you're curious on what it does exactly, it pretty much works exactly like the Friends in High Places talent, which I don't want to bother explaining because, well, it's just not a good talent to pick. It's kind of similar to Pack Mule in the way that part of the boon actually originates from a talent, except instead, it's entirely replaceable and borderline useless. So I'll just put this in the F tier. And last, but certainly not least, we have Simple. This flaw has a very strange history. During verse 1, the long and tedious progression system meant that Simple was one of the most painful options you could pick, since you were using twice the amount of time and effort in order to level up. If you asked anyone back then, they would tell you that Simple was one of the worst options simply because of how much more tedious and harder the game became. When the progression system was completely changed in verse 2 though, Simple went from one of the worst options to the best option to pick in all progressions. Due to the much faster nature of progression in verse 2, you can quickly hit power 20 and not suffer any downside at all. And because the Maverick and Simple flaw worked with the old progression system in mind, when the max power level was reduced from 60 to 20, it drastically changed how much both Simple and Maverick affected your progression to the point where it's pretty much unnoticeable. Couple that with the fact that this flaw counts as 2 points, and you get the ultimate S-tier flaw. And with that concludes the tier list of all the important boons and flaws in Deepwoken. This video took me way longer than I thought it would, so if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe if you enjoy my videos, as less than 1% of you guys watching are subscribed. I also found out about a few other unobtainable boons and flaws while researching for this video, which all could honestly make a future video itself. If you disagree with some of the stuff I said in this video, feel free to share them in the comments, but as always, take care and have a great rest of your day.